followed after the completion of the test planning process is a true success story for spatial planning in Switzerland, as well as for the national economy. More jobs exist after the test planning process than were lost when the paper factory was shut down. The settlements in the south will create about 600 jobs in the first phase. This number could rise to 2,000 upon final completion. When the cellulose factory was closed down, some 400 jobs were lost. Without the pre-investments by the public authorities, particularly by the Solothurn canton, it would have been impossible to restore the beauty of the Pearl of the Air.
The initial situation of the northern and southern areas was quite different. In the southern area, we only partly redeveloped the derelict land. We have one landowner, particularly the canton as the majority owner, who was looking to realize and implement the plans for this area in accordance with planning law as fast as possible, including with settlements. What was also extremely important was the cooperation with the landowner, the canton, the building authorities, and the economic promotion undertaken by the canton. As a result, we were able to promote our strategic reserve throughout Switzerland and beyond.
The northern area was different because the land was only owned by one party, but this owner was looking to get out en bloc, which meant that the whole area would be consigned to a developer. And a large number of other tasks had to be taken care of in addition to the initial planning work, such as plant decommissioning and removal of problematic substances, asbestos, etc. All this takes some time until the area is finally ready for a developer.
We were lucky to have a competent partner in the Lutherbach community when it came to the planning process, because they had already been confronted with planning questions before. In that sense, the community was well prepared through the Planning Commission, the Planning Authority, and the Communal Council. As a result, we were able to plan with our partners at eye level the entire time.
So dass wir eigentlich auf jederzeit auf Augenhöhe mit ihnen planen konnten.
Lutherbach had 10 years of planning experience with large-scale projects, while Riedholz had none. The natural shock over the closure of the factory was still present, followed by a new orientation and the question, what do we do with this? What are our tasks?
Then came
the change in legislation. I arrived along with 3 other new councillors. We were a bit taken aback by the dimension, and a kind of standstill actually occurred for us. I first had to dive into the topic, read the many documents, and tried to start a discussion with the canton. I myself had to build trust with the canton and the former owner, with Lothar Kind as the representative of Beauregard. All this took longer than I thought, and we later always said that we had certainly lost 6 to 12 months.
We seamlessly switched into zone planning mode and defined which terrain could be used for which utilization, with what height, etc., i.e. already very specific, as we were actually in the better situation. And then we waited for the government's decision to approve the plans. This was when Biogen arrived.
And we were lucky that Halter came to join us a bit later. The stage before Halter arrived was a period of great uncertainty. Fears were stoked that too many residents would come and affect our infrastructure, and that we would have to increase the taxes. I had a political fight on my hands. What cannot be forgotten is that the area was a blank spot for us. This means that nothing had happened down there actually affected us. It had been industrial land for hundreds of years, and it functioned autonomously. But all of a sudden we had the duty of developing it, and that represented a major challenge.
Und plötzlich mussten wir in die Erschließungspflicht, und das war eine sehr große Herausforderung.
We were in possession of a great derelict property at the southern foot of the Jura Mountains, an ideal location from our perspective. Then came the request from a global company. A competition process was started in Switzerland. We created a small task force of various experts at the cantonal level, which included representatives from the Office of Economic Promotion, the building authorities as the portfolio manager, the Office for the Environment, and even the tax administration, and of course from Spatial Planning.
In dieser Taskforce eingebunden und selbstverständlich auch die Raumplanung. Und dann ging es Geschwindigkeit.
The priority was to quickly demonstrate the qualities of this area. Availability was not a problem, and, extremely important for a global company, the area met all the specific requirements regarding water, wastewater, energy, etc. We had some answers ready, which we had intended to use as jokers for the competitive situation with other locations.
Of course you think, wow, this is gigantic, truly enormous. Naturally, a quick connection to the construction director could be established.
I passed, as I should, the complete dossier on Adisholz and the test planning, including all the necessary information on to my successor.
Switzerland Global Enterprise approached the Solothurn canton with their request shortly before Christmas. We stopped everything that was still going in the area on a secondary basis and concentrated on this one thing. It all went very fast.
We cooperated well in order to save some time, so that we wouldn't have to go from one department head to the next. All the distances were short. A whole lot of open questions had to be answered during the 3-month period between the request and the submission of the offer. But thanks to our test planning, we already had addressed a lot of these questions.
People wrote, "Nobody understands why a globally active company is developing something out in the boonies." But Bloggen themselves have a very different opinion.
From the perspective of my American colleagues from the Massachusetts headquarters, Solothurn and the Lutherbach community lie relatively close to Zurich Airport. On the other hand, we are also very close to the Roche Tower and the Novartis campus in Basel, where many specialists work and with whom we cultivate an active exchange. Due to the specified time frame, we were looking for fully zoned and properly planned industrial land, and not for any old kind of agricultural land. This dramatically shortened the list for potential areas in Switzerland. The existence of planning was the decisive factor for this project. In the end, this resulted in our being able to comply with our very aggressive timetable. Another advantage of the Lutherbach location was the fact that the canton was the owner of the land. We were then basically able to speak and negotiate with one partner only, enabling us to implement the entire settlement in a one-stop shop. The cooperation with the authorities during the settlement process was crucial. The communities were integrated into the process at a relatively early stage, even though the canton was securely in charge.
There was one small crisis to determine which authority was in charge, the planning office of the community or the Office of Spatial Planning. There is an anecdote about a meeting between the government council, the head of planning, my head of planning, the community vice president, and myself in a back room in a restaurant. We said to each other, how do we solve this whole thing? We owe the local population a communal process and are legally required to do so. But we also realized that the canton has to make a quick decision. So we started to get a bit creative. What is possible within the current legislation? And we found a shortcut which satisfies all the legal framework conditions, enables the population to weigh in, but progresses much faster.
Gesetzlichen Rahmenbedingungen erfüllt, der sämtliche Mitsprache der Bevölkerung erfüllt, aber der schnell ist.
It was very satisfying for us to see that progress was being made on our former derelict land on the south side, that something great was being created. This was an important aspect when we were actively looking for investors for the northern area. And it surely contributed to us being able to acquire an excellent investor for the northern area.
I was shocked when I first met Halter because they presented ideas which we had already seen, either during the test planning or the master planning, with high-rises and a density which was way too much for us. And I can remember when the feedback started coming in during the test master planning process. They want to put high-rise buildings here for this many people. Are they crazy? We are a small village. And so on. And look, where do we stand today? Yes, we will reach this density. We will double the population of our village.
This is when we saw the chance of developing a large, sustainable, intergenerational project. The first few times we visited the area, we noticed the size of the areal, which is absolutely unique in the whole of Switzerland. We saw an intact landscape around the area and an insular location in the sense that a leisure zone exists around the built-up structures. This nature is very important to us in order to balance out the huge density we are looking to realize in this clear-cut construction zone.
Hier in diesem scharf geschnittenen Baubereich dann realisieren möchten.
There was an impressive building stock which was important for the identity of the area and will remain important in the future. We also found a prospering economic environment. When we presented our development ideas to the canton and the community, it was vital for us to get the sense that both of them are committed to this transformation before we make our investment. Otherwise, I don't think we would have been willing to make such an investment.
Ein Commitment für diese Transformation seitens Gemeinde und Kanton gespürt haben und bekommen haben. Ansonsten wären wir wahrscheinlich nicht zu einer Investition bereit gewesen. In der Testplanung wurden
During the test planning process, a large number of issues were dealt with between the community, canton and landowners. This groundwork turned out to be immensely important. The risks for this area can actually be seen along a timeline. Unlike the agglomeration in Zurich, we were not pressured by the housing market or other utilizations. That is why this is an intergenerational project and we are looking to remain involved for the next 25 years. This transformation should be continuous and progress step by step.
Kontinuierliche Transformation geben.
Within the framework of the land use planning, which will run for another 18 months to 2 years, we are hoping to make the area accessible and known among the general population by opening it up. The dimension we have here is extraordinary. The cost of developing these planning instruments and our own cost for opening up the area and so on will amount to 2 to 3% of the total costs in the end. While this may be a small percentage, these investments will still have to be made and entail risks. For example, political processes with votes can result in such investments being lost in one single communal assembly meeting. For us, it is extremely important to be close to the population and to get a sense whether our intentions for the development for this area are being shared and have a chance of being accepted. This is why we put a lot of effort into communicating with the population. We organize open house days, presented our ideas to the communal assembly together with the politicians. And this way, we attempt to get the residents on board.
Und versuchen so, die Bevölkerung ins Boot zu holen.
Ein wichtiger Punkt, wenn man an so einem Ort...
One important aspect, if you're planning to do pioneering work in a location like this, is that you need the support. including the financial support of the big guys. All the investments here, the inventory, the utilizability of the space were financed by the landowner. You basically have a jester's license, because everyone thinks, this is great. We definitely have something here. There was never anything of this magnitude here before. It was impossible to relax here, to grab something to eat and check out what is going on. The driving idea here was the fact that there were numerous options as to what to do with the area, including from a gastronomic perspective. There's plenty of space, and it's a playground for me as a restaurateur who is looking to create gastronomic worlds. For this purpose, you need a lot of space and a good backdrop, because I just love these old walls. Combining the old with the new offers plenty of opportunities. Gastronomy connects by placing strangers in the same room, and that is very important here, because a lot of people will be coming to this area.
Auf dieses Areal kommen.
When I sit here and look around, I'm always fascinated by the fact that you can see the structural changes taking place. On the one hand, there is the brutal old industrial site, while the new aspect is characterized by delicate, intricate elements. Something has been created, like the phoenix rising from the ashes, and naturally has huge consequences for the entire economy. It impacts the housing situation and the available jobs. Something truly new is being created here.
It's really nice to be able to say derelict land is now being transformed into a valuable piece of new history in the Solothurn Canton, a new economic history.
Naturally, some outstanding questions remain which need to be clarified, particularly in relation to the northern area. We are facing the challenge that the village will suddenly double in size. On the one hand, we have the entire real estate market. If, in the ideal case, 2,000 jobs are created, housing also has to be available. The north presents a great challenge to the community if the population does indeed grow to twice its size. Schools and shopping facilities will be required, and there are also other challenges to the infrastructure which will have to be expanded.
What did we actually have to do with each other, Lutherbach and Riedholz? We both realized in unison absolutely nothing. I am convinced that this bridge will transform this nothing into something, enabling us to interact with each other.
Spatial planning means balancing interests as it consists of multi-layered aspects. You can't simply look at an area and then develop this terrain in your head. The small area will always be part of a larger area. This is why it is so important to balance the various interests and obtain political advice from the appropriate decision makers.
It is extremely important for us to know that the person in charge of such processes is experienced in these kind of procedures and know what stakeholders are involved in the political process and what their expectations are.
Welche Anspruchsgruppen an diesem politischen Prozess beteiligt sind, was diese für Ansprüche haben.
I would like to remind young spatial planners of the fact that land has never been as rare as it is today. It is an extremely valuable commodity, and we have to make sure that we find good solutions because, after all, spatial planning translates into the quality of our lives, how we subsequently live, work, spend our leisure time. This is why planning with the focus, land is something precious, has to start much earlier and really concentrate on efficiency and resources. And this is absolutely no less fun if you take the right approach. But it does represent more of a challenge than simply stepping onto a beautiful green lawn and saying, this is where we will build and the street goes here. Those times are gone for good.
This kind of work is impossible without compromises. Both sides have to learn from each other, have to respect each other, and also accept that the other side has a different opinion in order to find a common solution.
If spatial and general planning is good and works, it will not be noticed. But where it fails, it will stand out like a sore thumb. This is my main message. It is impossible to plan in front of the computer, sitting at a table. You have to be on site and see for yourself what it looks like. You have to stand somewhere and see the local conditions for yourself. And these impressions are different from those gained by sitting in front of the computer and planning something.
There aren't too many well-trained people with good ideas who should be involved in the process and who have a completely different perspective on the whole thing. Such a perspective is equally important for a joint enterprise. Success is not possible if the discussions are only restricted to experts.
Spatial planning has historically been criticized for allegedly being driven too much by other interests. And at the legislative level, it was realized that this cannot continue. Spatial planning needs to be strengthened and be equipped with better instruments. First and foremost, however, the development of settlements, including industrial ones, needs to be subjected to limits which can actually be implemented. Today, spatial planning is completely different from what I experienced 10 to 13 years ago. The mission of developing inwardly, of utilizing derelict zones before even considering new building zones, is now being taken extremely seriously.
I think it is important to not fall into the trap of another extreme, namely that there is only the conceptualization of pure housing purposes, that cities would separate the complete commercial segment so as to render this impossible. To me, as a former director of public economy, this is quite dangerous. We therefore also have to be able to provide jobs which haven't been outsourced. It must be possible to live where you work.
As a representative of the landowner, I would clearly say, don't forget that you are talking about land that doesn't belong to you. It's someone else's property. Someone who has different opinions, different problems, and different priorities. And this person doesn't think like a planner.
It is very important to understand the stakeholders, particularly the key stakeholders like landholders, regulators, authorities, neighbors, and so on, but really to understand their priorities, their thinking, their how they look at the process, and to understand this, to have a balanced process. I think it's very important. One should not underestimate let's say also the people involved, the personal relationships, that people can work well together, and that you build up trust during the process.
There are a lot of different learning points, but you know, to start early, when it first come to this, that the operation is going to be shut down, to start early, that was actually an important milestone, I would say. You know, if we had been waiting for 2, 3, 4 years, then it would be more difficult, I guess, you know, to find out what is actually going to happen on the site there. So I guess this is quite a generic learning, that you should always, when you know that something is going to happen on this particular site, then you should always, you know, try to find out what is the best way of planning it, how to add value to the site.
Perhaps the thoroughness that, in contrast to maybe the Norwegian way of doing things, I found that people in the area were not afraid of stopping and discussing and taking the necessary time to agree on a certain issue, and quite some detail, as you say. I think perhaps for good and for bad, we tend more to cut through in Norway and say, okay, that's a detail, let's move on, a little bit more impatient. So I think the thoroughness is something that has stayed in my mind as maybe a national characteristic. I don't know, at least this was my feeling.
Experimental simulations are thought experiments which are systematically prepared, executed, and then evaluated based on a script. It's very important to remember that the participants in these experimental simulations slip into different roles and experience at first hand how stakeholders truly act during real decision-making situations. It is important to have clear rules governing the implementation of such experimental simulations. Role differentiation, criticism, and 3 rounds. The first rule, role differentiation, means that the participants recognize how important it is to be able to put themselves in the situation of different stakeholders, to be able to get to know their ideas and interests, and take better account of them in the planning process. The second rule concerns criticism. Criticism is necessary in order to progress from the first vague ideas to robust solutions. The ability both to express and handle criticism must be trained. This is what we are hoping to convey at the ETH Zurich, supporting a critical approach to thinking, acting, and making decisions. The third rule is the rule of 3 rounds. This means that the first attempt should be made quickly to identify what the core of the problem actually is. Step 1, expressing vague assumptions about the solution. Step 2, reinforcing such solutions or rejecting one or the other solutions. Step 3, consolidating solutions and optimal preparation of arguments in their defense.
Zu konsolidieren und die Lösungsrichtung möglichst gut argumentieren zu können.
These 3 project rounds enable the participants to understand that a lot of time is needed until solutions have matured to such a point that they can be discussed, criticized, and communicated both internally as well as externally.
Raumplanung ist
Spatial planning is teamwork and requires the willingness to make joint learning experiences in the face of difficult, unsolved problems. None of the parties involved are in possession of the ultimate wisdom and also need to learn how to learn.
Die Methode
The method and the well-proven test planning format constitute a reliable framework for all the stakeholders involved.
Wenn man so will, auch eine Bühne für die beteiligten Akteure. Einsatz von Testplanung.
The application of test planning processes is part of professional spatial planning. It thus sets special requirements on all parties involved, and of course the directors of such processes. These persons should be mature personalities with expert knowledge, who are able to maintain their calm in conflict situations and build bridges of understanding between the interests of various parties. As a result, trust is established between the involved parties, as well as the confidence to find solutions together, even though they may be obscured by the fog of uncertainty in the early stages. This is almost always the case for extremely challenging and strategically significant tasks, but it should not keep us from trying. The example of Attisholz is an encouragement to do so and emphasizes yet again the fascination of spatial planning.
Die Faszination von Raumplanung.